so I have some thoughts on a story concept by a man named Richard C. Meyer. He goes by the name Diversity in Comics on YouTube. This is a story concept that he called Displacers, which was, the idea was that people get thrown out of their original time periods from like ancient Egypt or the 13th century England or 16th century Arabia, something like that. And they all end up in the modern world. And after attempts are made to integrate these temporal fugitives into modern society, it sort of dawns on people that no, they're not, there's just too much of a mental gap there. They're not going to be able to integrate because there's just too much difference. And so these like reservations are made that are sort of like reenactor villages almost, except all the people in them are actually from the original, the time period that they're portraying. And then you have, you know, you don't have any cell phones in there or anything, so that it's just like, this is a place where these people can actually be comfortable and live their lives the way they would have wanted to back in their own time. Now, since I'm a reenactor, I found this really quite interesting. Because, you know, as a story idea, you know, somebody goes into one of these and you have to get them out without, you know, causing too much of a ruckus. So reenactorisms sort of have to be dealt with here. Mr. Meyer decided he wanted it to sort of, like the cutoff point to be in the 1950s. And I think, honestly, I'm not too cool with that. I think that anything after the 1850s should be integratable. I mean, he mentioned the idea of like slavery in America as some sort of, as a barrier to people entering modern society. But the thing is, technologically, at that time, you had steam engines, you had early cars, you had telegraphs, you had, you know, you had the entirety of the North, which didn't have, of the United States, which didn't have slavery. So just tell them to act like, you know, everything's the North now. We don't have slavery, that's a thing of the past, just kind of deal with it. And I think that after the 1850s, you know, fashion actually hasn't changed too much. We still wear button-down shirts and trousers. You know, formal clothing is still a three-piece suit. That actually hasn't changed. The exact cut has changed, yes, but, you know, the overall effect is quite similar. You actually see sort of more changes within a decade than you do between decades. And so I think that it would actually be conceivable for somebody from that time period, you know, 1850 onward, to integrate. Before 1850 is when we start getting into the interesting stuff. So, you would want to split everything up into 50-year chunks. Because within any 50 years, that's about how long it takes for things to become properly different. So, you know, you have early 19th century and late 19th century, and these are two different time zones, which is what he called these temporal reservations. And then you'd have the late 18th century and the early 18th century, the late 17th century, the early 17th century. And then I would argue that it should be broken down in other ways as well. So, you know, for example, do not put the Greeks with the Turks. Things will go wrong. You know, if you've got you'd want to have a distinct Turkic community and a distinct Greek Southeastern European community, and then a separate, distinct Western European community. Although I would argue that the Eastern and Western European communities would be able to mesh. You know, you might easily get away with with simulating a Central European town or large city by by medieval standards, for example. Just simulate that, and then everybody is going to be able to gravitate around this as something that's, you know, familiar to both East and West, to Northern Europe and Southern Europe. So you might, you know, you can get away with that to a very large degree. Then you've got the East, and you're going to have you know, you might actually end up having to have several Chinese time zones just for one time period, because China is such a huge country, and was even back then, that, you know, despite sharing a writing system, so you can write a letter from a southern province to a northern province, and they'll be able to read it, they wouldn't be able to hold a conversation in person. So you might end up having to simulate like a bunch of different villages, and each village is a different location from China. Similar things would happen to Africa. And then, like, as you go back further, things are going to change. And I'm just going to focus in on medieval Europe because that's my sort of specialty. Medieval Europe and a bit of Near East, you know, Crusades era. So, just totally focused in on that. 500 AD to 1500 AD is the Middle Ages. Things did not stay the same during that time. In fact, 500 to 1000 is technically it's either called the early Middle Ages or the migration period, for rather obvious reasons. You had Germanic tribes moving through from the 300s onward, actually, and settling. And by around 1000, AD 1000, things have settled. So now you have the Franks, the Goths, the Visigoths, you know, all of them. And in the north you have the Norwegians, Swedes, Danes. You know, there was no Vikings. You know, the Vikings as an overarching civilization never existed. You had Danes, Utes, Norwegians, Swedes, Finns, who are just a completely different ethnic group altogether, but there they are. They're actually related to the Hungarians. But they sort of share sort of similar theology with the Norse tribes. So there's that. Every 50 years, you would want a hard breakover. So people who came from anywhere from AD 500 to 550 get their own time zone. Then everybody, you know, and you'd want the Germanic groups together as much as possible, and you basically just tell them, hey, you guys are just going to have to get along, pretend that this is a town, that this is a market town, and you're all just here for a while. And that would be that. You might end up having to simulate several towns just from one area. Mr. Meyer said he wanted them each to be a couple of square miles, and honestly, that's not enough. You would want like maybe, I don't know, 5 to 10 square miles, at least, so that you would have room for sort of like for farmland, for a town center, for a village, and for a forest, because that's kind of what you need. You know, maybe a couple square miles actually might work, but it would be cramped. You would really run the risk of people wandering off of this thing pretty easily, or in. And depending on how tightly they're clustered, you really might not want them to be at a point where they can see each other. You do not want the 12th century Normans to be looking at the 16th century Saracens. There's just going to be this level of what the hell is that going on that just wouldn't work out very well. So, and then fashion change, that's another thing. You look at movies about the Middle Ages like Kingdom of Heaven, which is a movie that shouldn't exist in my opinion, but there you have it. And they show you a sort of stereotypical Hollywood version of the Middle Ages with, long swords and chainmail and, leather trousers. Leather trousers, I hate that trope, but there you have it. It's part of Hollywood now. They're expected to have leather trousers because at least it's not tights. Well, give me a second. '13th century, hosen. Yes, these are woolen tights that are suspended from a belt. Tights are historical, leather trousers aren't. With the Vikings, Vikings, the Norse tribes and the Rus, you actually kind of had baggy, very loose, baggy linen trousers, which eventually developed into the later medieval underwear, and then the socks that they wore developed into the hosen, and eventually what had started out as trousers became modern underwear, and what had started out as socks became modern trousers, which is a bit of an interesting progression. And one might even ask when we're going to see this trend repeat all over again. I highly doubt it actually, but anything's possible. So main articles of clothing for most of history, at least in Europe, are going to be made out of wool as an outer layer with an inner layer of linen. Undergarments are going to be made out of linen, except for the very highest classes who might have silk. Silk is going to be something that is just reserved for extremely wealthy merchants and the nobility. Another thing, colors. The Middle Ages were colorful. Brown and gray? Not really. Not really a lot of brown and gray. Lots of blues, yellows, reds, greens. Very vibrant colors until the 16th century. And then even then you've got, at least in German-influenced areas, you just throw as many colors as you can together and just see what comes out of that. Spain is actually kind of the exception to the rule for being very somber as far as the colors of textiles go, at least for the nobility, with black being very common. It wasn't for most of Europe. Most of Europe, the higher class you were, the more colors you were going to be wearing. Landesknechts, the Landsknights, German mercenaries of the late 15th and early 16th century wore incredibly bright, extravagant costumes. Mixing and matching, puffed and slashed sleeves, bits that were really tight to the skin, bits that were quite loose. They actually received sort of a reputation for this. They were like the fashion icons of the era. So moving on from fashion, I will go to armor and weapons. So, armor for the most of the Middle Ages, so from 500 to 1300. The main piece of body armor is going to be a chainmail shirt. It's just going to, it gets longer and longer from being about the same size as a t-shirt to being a sort of a gown very similar to this. So, this, but made out of chainmail with an integrated hood. This is a 13th century cot. Underneath the mail would be worn something like this. This is gambesson. They go by different names: gambesson, accaton, arming jacket. They come in different thicknesses. This is made of linen and padded quite thickly. It's not actually very thick. It's, all things considered, you might actually say it's quite thin, but it's very stiffly padded so that it can absorb a blow. So the chainmail stops the blow, the gambesson absorbs it. And then you'd have a helmet, sort of like this one. Helmet, this is a rather low quality one, I admit, but it does have a few features that should be noted. For one, this is a Norman style, so nasal bar, it's actually a bit stripped down from the Norse style of helmet, which had a bar that would go up like this into a spectacled look. You can look up spectacled helms online. So, some things to note about it. These would be raised from a single piece of iron most of the time, or made from two halves with a rivet with a band going up and over the top and connecting it with pairs of rivets on both sides. And nasal bar. Mine's welded construction, which is ahistorical but easy to do in the modern day. Inside is a liner. This keeps it sitting off of your head. The liner does not have to be padded. It just has to keep the helmet away from your head, so that when force hits the helmet, instead of the metal of the helmet being jammed into your head, there's a bit of space for it to flop around. And that allows it to absorb impacts. Underneath of that would be an arming cap. This is functionally identical to the gambesson as far as material goes, but a little thinner. And there you have it. This actually makes this helmet completely secure on my head, very comfortable. All good things here. Swords are not a primary weapon, basically ever. What is a primary weapon is something like this, the spear. The spear is a primary weapon across all classes. All social castes use spears. You can't get away from them. They're just there. The sword is a secondary weapon. You move from one-handed swords to two-handed swords in the late 13th century. And as the 14th century goes along, you eventually come to very, very developed systems of swordplay, such as those developed by the fencing masters Johannes Lichtenauer and Fiore de Liberi. I'll provide links in the description for videos of people fencing in that style. So yeah, armor developed from that, chainmail, gambesson, simple helmet, to adding a coat of plates to the surcoat. So coat of plates is just, you got a surcoat which goes over the chainmail, and then you rivet rectangular pieces of plate to it. And then, this is heavy, so they decided to shape it to tuck in and sit at the natural waist, so that instead of having this all hanging from your shoulders, it's now supported on your hips. Eventually the plates got larger and larger until it was a single breastplate covered with a layer of leather or cloth. By the end of the 14th century, they decided to just do away with the covering. You have a single, one-piece, standalone breastplate. Helmets became more and more massive. You had great helms that covered the entire face, and then you had a separate helm called a bassinet under that. Eventually, the great helm was done away with, and the bassinet became the main helmet. And they had all sorts of extravagant visor shapes. So these are things to look at if you want to get an idea of what you're doing. Eventually you get to the styles of Gothic plate armor from Germany, Milanese plate from northern Italy, and you have even distinct English styles that developed as well. This is all stuff that happened. This is all, this is important in its own way. You know, the centers of armor exports were Milan and Solingen, Germany and Italy produced armor for the rest of Europe. Then you, into the 16th century, you have distinct Spanish styles start to develop, like those helmets with the the comb Ryan helmets, with that sort of coxcomb look, and flared brim, and those the breastplates become more tapered to give a sort of a more classical look, reminiscent of sort of Grecian designs, and also reminiscent, incidentally, of the fashion of clothing at the time. Then as you move forward, you get developments like having, instead of chainmail defending the gaps between the van brace and the rear brace, you get these, especially for tournament armors, bands that allow it to expand and contract while having the entire inner elbow covered in plate. And in all this, chainmail never really went away until armor in general went away. In the 17th century, people would put chainmail on the, very fine chainmail, on the glove, on the palm of a glove, so that when fencing with rapiers, they could bat away and catch the opponent's blade without fear of getting cut. So anyways, that's been my thoughts on sort of how things should be divvied up, and just things to keep in mind when designing this. Of course, I'm not going to suggest any stories in this, just things to keep very strongly in mind. Thank you for watching.